All right. It's been a while since I've been live here on LinkedIn Live. We are also simulcasting over on Facebook and on YouTube. I will tell you that if you're seeing me on the Facebook, as it were, and you want to join the conversation, if you want to join the chat, come on over to LinkedIn because the LinkedIn Live chat is going to be active. And so I am going to get my slide deck up here, and then we will get into today's webinar. Today's webinar is the first of a 7-part series. And y'all, I wrote a book. And it's interesting because I used to work in academia, whatever one wants to call it. And in that setting, there was a lot of pressure to publish for faculty. I was not a faculty for most of my career. For most of my career, I was working in student affairs. And so it's the people who keep colleges and universities running outside the classroom, the people who run residence halls and career development centers and multicultural centers and uh, campus activities departments and orientation departments and all those things that make a college or university run. I did that for 20 years, but I worked with faculty, and I know that there was a lot of pressure to publish. I eventually went through my own process and got a doctorate and had to publish my dissertation, right? And then, but also along the way, as a practitioner, even though practitioners of student affairs, there wasn't a lot of pressure to publish for our careers. I did want to publish to just share either research I was doing, share sort of best practices I was engaged in. And so I did some publishing where you go through the gauntlet of, sending manuscripts to editors and they tell you, yes, we accept it, no, we don't. Or in my case, pretty frequently it was, you know, more of, hey, we think we could accept this if you fix some things, right? If you work with us. And so I worked with editors and got published the kind of quote unquote old fashioned way a few times. And those are all things I'm very proud of. But this book is self-published. And it's funny because I think when I worked in higher education, I sort of bought into a stigma about self-publishing that I was conditioned around, and so that's something that I've had to shake when writing this book. So I see we're getting an audience now. So please in the chat, let me see if I can get the chat up here just so I don't miss anything. But if you're in the chat, say hello and tell me where you're joining from. I'm excited that you joined me today to talk about this book and to talk about me as the author and really where this book came from. That's what I want to talk to you about. The rest of this series, the sessions, the second through seventh session, are going to be chapters in the book, and so I'm just going to take a chapter at a time and share some of what's in that chapter. Now, if you already have the book and you've read it, then you'll be in a position where you can ask some more in-depth question about some of these concepts. If you haven't, don't worry. You can still join any of the sessions and still have a robust conversation, right? Because I'm sure that those of you who are on with me now are leaders in various settings. Hey, Jennifer from Balsam Lake, Wisconsin, fantastic. But I'm sure you're leaders in different settings, and so you'll each have things that you'll be able to offer to the conversation, right? Leadership is not owned by any one person. It doesn't matter how many degrees you get. I've got lots of degrees and wrote a dissertation on leadership, and I still learn something about leadership almost every day. So let me pull my slide deck up here so y'all can follow along with what we are doing today. And I'm going to do this and share my screen. The author, there we go. So today's session is all about me. It's about the author. Let me see if I can swap these because I would like the slideshow to be bigger than me. There we go. So this is my formal bio, and if you've ever seen me speak at a conference, do a keynote, you've probably seen this bio. This bio makes it look like I have my life together because I've got several graduate degrees. I'm a certified Myers-Briggs interpreter. I'm the senior consultant at Adaptive Challenge Consulting. I've worked at a lot of universities, but also prior to my work in colleges and universities, I had some other interesting careers that I'll talk about in a little bit. But this makes it look like my act is together. I will tell you that I'm particularly proud of getting a doctorate in leadership, right? And this is something that not everybody studies this. A lot of people study it informally, and that's great. And I've studied it informally a lot, as you'll see in my little slide presentation here. But I've also studied it formally. I've studied what academic literature says about what leadership is, what effective leadership is, what good leadership is, and what bad leadership is. And more importantly, how do we foster better leadership, right? And so through that formal study, it was able to really, really hold up a mirror to the informal study that I had been doing for a long time. And let me tell you, well, also this is the real me. And those of you who've seen me do speeches know that one of the jokes I lead with is that those two numbers at the top are very important to me. The 2.16 was my GPA when I finished college. So a lot of my friends graduated magna cum laude and summa cum laude. I just graduated, thank the laude. Can't believe this dude even made it, right? And that number 7 is how long it took me to finish my original college degree. You know, for most people, it takes 4, maybe 5. It took me 7, and my GPA was 2.16. So if you look back at that last slide and you think, wow, Dr. Mueller's got his act together, maybe now-ish, but life is full of twists and turns, and I was not a great student. As a matter of fact, the reason I got into student affairs was because my involvement in clubs and organizations on campus kept me from failing out of college a few different times. And so I appreciated the co-curricular and the extracurricular engagement. It made a huge difference in my life, and that shaped the last big chunk of my career. These are some other things that kind of make me interesting. One of the things is at the bottom, you'll notice I was an improv comedian for about 9 years at a comedy club. And I have some friends in leadership development that work for a very well-known international leadership development organization. And I went and did a little in-service for them for their faculty and staff. And they followed up with me. They said, well, we want to do some work with you potentially, but we need about 5 or 6 people that have an improv comedy background and a doctorate in leadership. And I can't find anybody else, right? So if you're listening right now and you happen to know someone who's got a terminal degree in leadership, who also has done improv comedy, let me know. I might have some cool opportunities for them. One of the things I do whenever I have conversations, I love to show this graphic. This graphic is, it features the FedEx logo. I'm in Central North Carolina, and FedEx has a large presence here. But when I speak to audiences, typically about 25% of audiences that I engage with have never seen that in between the E and the X in the FedEx logo, there's an arrow in the negative space. The negative space between the orange E and the orange X creates an arrow. And so I share this image frequently when I do keynotes and when I do workshops, because my goal, I realize that between 1/4 and 1/3 of every audience that I engage with has never seen this arrow before. They've never seen it. And then suddenly they're going to see it. And the amazing thing is they're never, ever, ever going to unsee it, right? You cannot have an aha moment, right? Aha moments are when your mind stretches and notices something, but once you've noticed it, you can't aha that moment. And so my hope is when I write this, as I wrote this book, that it reflects multiple opportunities for you to have what many of my audiences call a FedEx arrow moment, finding that thing that you can never unperceive. For blind folks, there's a really cool example called the Wilhelm scream, or for anybody for that matter, called the Wilhelm scream. But if you're blind or limited vision, the Wilhelm scream is something that everybody listening to me right now, everybody on this webinar has heard the Wilhelm scream. If you're a hearing person, you've heard the Wilhelm scream probably 50 or 60 times in your life. And you might not know that you've been hearing the same scream that was sampled from an old cowboy movie, right? So you can look up the Wilhelm scream on YouTube and hear it, and you'll be like, oh my gosh, yeah, I've heard that scream everywhere. Yeah. So again, whether it's the Wilhelm scream, whether it's the FedEx arrow, my hope is that this book is full of aha moments that you can never aha. So let me tell you a little bit more. So my career has been a winding career. I mentioned some kind of higher ed part. I've been a pharmacy technician. I sold computers and cell phones, have done Disney travel agent work, director of orientation, computer lab attendant, Etsy shop owner, y'all, director of a career center, a waiter, you name it. I'm not going to read all of these things because I'm running out of breath here. But I've worked in finance, I've worked in sales, I've worked in hospitality and restaurants. And I've worked in higher ed, and I've worked in pharmacies, right? And so I've had a lot of different opportunities to work with managers and leaders in different sectors. And then that has only helped when I went to sort of study leadership formally, because I had different careers and different work engagements that I could kind of check back on and compare against this academic literature that's sometimes written in a vacuum. Sometimes people writing academic literature are building on other academic literature, which is great because it's deepening our knowledge of sort of the philosophy of leadership, and in some studies how leadership is managed or measured. But it's very, very valuable to have one foot in an academic camp and another foot in just the working world outside of academia. And so these kinds of really random jobs each taught me a little something about leadership, and sometimes I was very conscious of it, and sometimes I wasn't. But they gave me lessons along the way, and I'm going to tell you something neat about how I collected those lessons. Um, as far as how I got curious about leadership, and this is for those who've read the book, this is in my introduction, and I'm not going to read the full introduction, but I'm going to tell a little bit of the story, which is I was a band nerd in high school. And so in the chat, if anybody was a band nerd, definitely let me know what you played. And also for those of you who've just joined us, say hello from the chat. I'd love to know who else here. But I was a band nerd in high school. I was a trombone player, and we had class rings back in the 80s and 90s, and it was sort of a big deal to put your accomplishments on your class rings. And so, if you were on the tennis team or the football team or the basketball team or academic team or marching band, you would put your activities. Well, I wanted nothing more than to be the drum major. If you don't know what a drum major is, it's the person in the band who stands up on a podium and conducts so that the band can follow along. I thought that right there, that is the epitome of leadership, right? Everybody's eyes are locked on you. If you move your hands faster, they will march faster and play faster. If you move your hands slower, they'll march slower and play slower. And I thought that's the epitome of being a leader. And I was already in the band. And so I told myself, well, I'm not going to allow myself to get a class ring until I can put something really cool on it. And I want to put drum major on that class ring. And so I auditioned to be the drum major. I tried out and I didn't get it leading into my sophomore year. And then I tried leading into my junior year, didn't get it again. Tried out for it my senior year, didn't get it. Then I tried out for a drum major, I think 4 times in college. Y'all want to know something interesting? I've never bought a class ring. So this class ring was a symbol for me, and the symbol was about reaching what I thought was sort of that formal leadership position, right? I wanted to be the drum major. I wanted to literally lead the band. One thing, though, that I do talk about in the book that is a little bit of a surprise, and this helped me learn one of my first lessons about leadership, is that when I was at the end of my junior year, when I found out that I didn't make drum major, it was announced, the new drum major was announced at our band banquet. It was an end of the year banquet for the marching band. And it was, I found out leading into my senior year that I had not made drum major, and I was in tears. I was so sad. And a dear friend of mine actually got drum major, and she was a fantastic drum major. Her name was Janine, and she was amazing. And also, I recognize that that in addition to probably being a better drum major than I was one of a very small handful of trombone players, and I think trombone players were I think we needed extra trombone players to be playing and not conducting. And so there were lots of great reasons that I didn't make drum major. But fast forward to my senior year band banquet, right? So at the end of my junior year, I'm sad because leading into my senior year, I found out I was not the drum major, and I was so sad. And then my senior year, the band banquet came around, and at the band banquet, 5 awards were given out. And by the end of the night, I had won 3 of the 5 awards. But that's not the cool part. This is not a story about individual achievement. One of the awards that was about individual achievement was voted on by my peers, and that was a special honor. But that's not what the real story is about. This isn't about how cool Alan is. That's not what the story is about. What the story is about is that one of the awards in particular was the Director's Choice Award. Our band director that year had gotten cancer, and he had taken a leave of absence, and it was really tough. And I had 4 friends in the band. One of them was my drum major friend, and then it was a few percussionists and a clarinet player. And the 5 of us just sort of took a leadership role in the band. It wasn't formal. It wasn't prescribed. We just did the things that needed doing. We tried to sort of keep the spirit alive. When it came time for the director to give the Director's Choice Award, he explained that for the first time in his life, he couldn't pick one person, and that instead he picked five of us. He called us the gang. And so that award was given to five of us. And so when I say I won three awards, I won two individual ones, but I won the most important one was the one I won in community with those four other band members. And that was my first lesson in leadership. The lesson was number one, titles aren't always the same as leadership. The title or the formal position is not always the same as leadership. That was number one lesson. And number two is the best leadership is leadership you do as a group, where it's not about individual achievement, it's not about individual recognition, it's about a group. And so I still think fondly about that sort of moment. But that is, I think, when I started getting curious about what the heck leadership is, right? And that disrupted my ideas of what leadership was. My idea was that leadership was whoever's on the podium conducting the band. And that's true, but also there are other ways to lead. And that drum major, the way that she led was sure conducting on the podium, but she also led in other ways, along with the other four of us that just led in other ways. And our band director recognized that. And so that's where my curiosity about leadership comes from, is the fact that I was a band geek all through high school and college. So that's the beginning lesson. And by the way, if you've ever read about servant leadership is the idea that sometimes you're leading through service. And when you think about young people involved in marching band, high school, college, they're working hours and hours and hours in the hot sun. They're wearing wool uniforms on Saturdays. They are there bright and early on Saturday mornings to squeeze in one more rehearsal before the football game. And their performance, whether it's an 8-minute performance or a 10-minute performance, their performance is performed at a venue where everyone in the stands has come to watch something else, to watch football. You want to talk about servant leadership? Look at your high school and college marching bands. Those folks are putting in immense amounts of work to add something to the game. Trust me, you notice when the bands are not there, but to add something to a game that's not the main performance. The main performance is the football game. So that's a great example of servant leadership that I just think, yeah. So I got more curious. I was such a band nerd that I was in a group called Kappa Kappa Psi. Kappa Kappa Psi is a band fraternity. I'm not making this up. It's a real thing. Two things that were very special. One is that our particular chapter of Kappa Kappa Psi was co-ed. And so we had men and women in the fraternity together. The women we called brothers, in homage to the original founders. We also had a sister organization called Tau Beta Sigma, the Texas Band Sorority, TBS, Tau Beta Sigma. And they are co-ed as well. And the men of Tau Beta Sigma can be called sisters as well. And so in homage to their founders. And so even though each organization was founded as a fraternity for men and sorority for women, they are both co-ed on many campuses across the country. Not all campuses. Some of the campuses where they are not co-ed are HBCUs, historically Black colleges and universities. Something that was so fascinating and that helped me begin my journey towards sort of cultural humility and intercultural awareness was that Kappa Kappa Psi, where I was in the country, half of our chapters were at predominantly white universities and colleges, and the other half were at historically Black universities and colleges. And so the traditions between the groups at the different campuses melded and meshed and formed this fascinating intercultural experience. And to the point where I learned to step and stepped in my homecoming step show at my university as a part of Kappa Kappa Psi. And I learned from somebody who had come from a historically Black university. And it was a rich part of our tradition. And so through Kappa Kappa Psi, I learned more about leadership in a few ways. One was how to be in community with my brothers. And again, I'm using that term, men and women were both involved. How to understand my culture by experiencing other cultures and experiencing when cultures intersect and overlap. As a white person, stepping is not part of my heritage, but stepping is a tradition in Kappa Kappa Psi that is a very clear connection and very clear nod to the deep presence that they have on historically Black colleges and universities supporting those bands. And so I was invited into that tradition, and it was amazing. It was amazing. Also, though, I served as an officer in that organization, and I learned a lot of things about how to motivate people, how to organize a schedule, how to, train future leaders. One of my main jobs was sort of training the incoming members of the group. And so I started doing leadership development training. I didn't think of it as leadership development training, but I was doing leadership development training. Fast forward to that picture on the right. Those are some students of mine from my last job in higher ed. I worked at Salem College, which is the oldest continuously operating women's college in the country, and I was the assistant dean of students. And we did a leadership program. It was called Leaders in Training, LIT. I did not come up with the name. The person who came up with the name was like, yeah, it's leadership, it's Leaders in Training, it's LIT. And I said, hey, friend, I love the name. And this was 2017, 2018. I said, I love the name, but people aren't going to be saying it's lit 2 or 3 years from now. That's going to be, we don't have leftover, leadership programs from the 70s called groovy leadership, right? So, but she said, oh, it's okay. It'll still be Leaders in Training. Like, sure, Leaders in Training. But in Leaders in Training, if those of you who are on, if you've ever done a high ropes course or a low ropes course, say yes, high ropes, yes, low ropes in the chat. But there's a whole sort of educational science to high ropes courses and low ropes courses. There's a sort of educational method, experiential pedagogy, where if you've done a high ropes course or a low ropes course, a lot of times the mechanics of what you're doing is you're working with a team to get from one log to another log using something, or to get from one space to another space, or to get someone over a wall, or all of these different physical, tactical things that you're trying to do in a high ropes or a low rope setting. But the magic comes from after the activity is finished, when you sit in a circle and you reflect. You reflect on what happened. And there's sort of a educational method that's based in experiential education learning that can take something as simple as a silly activity where we're throwing a stuffed animal around the room, and through the right kinds of reflective questions, we would get some really deep reflections on leadership, on communication, on listening, on multiculturalism, on all of these different things that are critical for leaders to understand. So that particular group there was one of, I'm going to guess, 30 different cohorts of student leadership groups that I facilitated on multiple campuses. I created emerging leader programs on 3 different campuses, revitalized one on a 4th campus, and ran one on another campus as well. And so these were not classes. Nobody got credit. They didn't get a scholarship. They got nothing. And this was very against the conventional wisdom at most colleges and universities where I worked, because the belief was students will show up if you give them a free t-shirt, free pizza, or money or class credit, that you had to give them something for them to show up. Well, I had an experience early on in my career where I realized, what if the something that they get is just a worthwhile experience where they find community and learn about leadership? And so these programs, every campus where I built them, they would start small, and within 3 semesters, a year and a half, they'd be so big that we had to kind of expand. And I did this 3 different times. And so changing a leadership culture at multiple organizations, and the ripple effects are things you would not believe. There are at one of the institutions, the leadership program got so big that the students were more thirsty for engagement, and there weren't enough clubs on campus to fulfill their needs to get engaged and involved in things. So they formed some local fraternities and sororities, people who had come out of our leadership program. I was at a different college, and the cheerleading coach got cut, and the cheerleading team without a coach couldn't really operate. Well, the cheerleading team, I think, was like 9 students, and 5 of them had gone through my leadership program. So the semester after a few of them had finished, they came to my office and said, we're going to restart the cheerleaders, but as a club, because we've learned all these things about leadership. And they also asked me to be their advisor, which was very interesting. But the bottom line is that these leadership programs aren't just about teaching you leadership skills so you can go do something. It's about helping you establish a culture of leadership on your campus. In research world, there's a group called the W.K. Kellogg Foundation, and they've done research on leadership programs. And one of their findings was that universities, corporations, K-12 systems, nonprofits, that organizations that have formal leadership programs, they get leadership gains even among people who aren't in the programs. So if you're a corporation and you have an emerging leader program and you get 20 people to participate each year, but then you have a staff of 1,500, well, those other, if the others who aren't participating will still hear new language, new ideas, see examples of leadership in action from those who've been in the programs. And so one of the things that people think, especially in corporate, is that, to get the benefits of the leadership program, everyone has to go through the leadership program. And that's ideal. But there are other times when, if you get maybe 25% of your team, 30% of your team, or even half of your team to go through a leadership program, the other folks are going to pick up some things along the way, which is fascinating, right? Anyway, so I did a lot of those emerging leader programs. I thought they were amazing, to the point where eventually I wrote a dissertation about those programs. And so I traveled all over the country. I got grants to cover my travel, and I got to travel to amazing universities. Also, I wanted to be very conscious about my cultural lenses, right? You may have noticed I'm a white person, right? I'm a man. I'm not currently disabled. I'm college educated. There's a lot of things that make me me, that are lenses that I always have with me, right? And so I can't ever leave the house one day and be like, you know what? I'm going to be white today, but I'm going to leave man at home. Like, that's not how it works. All of Allen goes everywhere I go, right? And so I wanted to be very conscious of that. So the three universities that I ended up studying, one was a PWI, predominantly white university institution, Emory down in Atlanta. One was a minority serving institution, which is University of South Florida in Tampa, and they had a critical number of Hispanic and Latine students that made it, where there was no clear majority. And so they were sort of at what's called minority serving institution. And then Howard University, which is one of the most storied historically Black universities in the country. And I got to go study how they teach leadership, and it was life changing. All the programs were a little different, but some of my questions were about, how are you teaching this? How are you teaching it? What's the format you're using? Is it a one weekend kind of retreat? Is it a full semester program, a half semester program, a year long program? One of the programs was a year long program, and it involved 60 students. At the end of the year, they all went to China together for a month to have a cultural immersion program. So it was fascinating how these universities and colleges were teaching leadership. But the other thing I really wanted to know was, how do you know if you've been effective? There are a lot of places, corporations, colleges, universities, K-12 systems, that are doing leadership programs, but do they know how to measure whether they were effective or not? They usually think, well, we'll kind of feel it, we'll know, we'll sense it if it gets better. But you can actually measure this, and this is part of why I got some advanced degrees, because there's an art and a science to how do you measure or assess or research whether or not a program is effective. And then, more importantly, if leadership is constantly evolving, if you find something, if you take a cohort of 20 leaders through a program and they finish the program and you assess it and see how you did and look for certain outcomes, if you missed the mark on a few outcomes, do you go change the program to make it better? So not only do you assess how well you're doing, but once you've assessed it, do you use that knowledge to make the leadership training better in the future, right? So it's a loop. It becomes a loop. And so that's what I studied. And y'all, I got in the weeds, and it was life changing. It was tedious work at times, inspiring work at times. But that's my academic background, is how do organizations teach leadership. Funny side note. I'm not going to get too political, maybe a little, but funny side note. Colleges and universities, the first time that a big number of universities across the country started co-curricular leadership programs, meaning leadership programs that weren't classes. You didn't get an academic credit for it. Co-curricular or extracurricular leadership programs. There was a huge surge in leadership program development on college and university campuses around the Richard Nixon administration. I am sure there were faculty and deans and administrators and student affairs professionals sitting in rooms going, okay, what are we teaching effectively at our university? Are we teaching history effectively? Great. Chemistry? Great. Biology? Great. Business? Awesome. Teacher education? Great. We're teaching all these things. But there was a moment when these administrators paused and asked, are we teaching ethical leadership? Are we teaching ethical leadership? The Nixon administration was so embroiled in controversy and ethically questionable things that universities and colleges responded by going, we need to invest more deeply in the teaching of ethical leadership. By the way, there was another small bump in college and university leadership program development in 2016. I also expect more development soon. And y'all can take that for what I you can read straight between the lines on that one. So the bottom line is that leadership by definition, as far as what is leadership, which actually my next free webinar, we're going to get squarely into what is leadership. But leadership does and kind of has to involve an ethical component. The idea of unethical leadership is sort of a misnomer, right? That leadership by definition should be ethical. And we'll delve into that more deeply on the next one. So, as far as how this book came about, y'all, I am an extrovert. And even though I would love to be one of those people who journals, I think that I so admire people who journal and are reflective on a daily basis and write in a journal every day. That's not me. I'm not that disciplined, and I'm particularly extroverted. So sitting by myself and writing doesn't sound fun. But 22 years ago, I had this idea that maybe when, and that was before my doctorate, before my ed specialist degree. I think I had just finished my master's. So we're talking like 2003, right? So 22 years ago, I thought one day I'd love to learn how to sell the idea, how impactful leadership can be for the organization. Oh my gosh, Jennifer, yes, it's 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 tough. And if you want to message me at some point, I can give you some ways to frame it for your organization, because sometimes it seems a little aloof, and sometimes it seems a little out of range. Um, oh, great, Jennifer, thanks for joining. Um, but so as far as this, because I'm not a journaler, because I don't journal, and I wasn't disciplined enough to journal every day. About 22 years ago, I created an email address when Gmail started becoming popular, and I created a Gmail called Alan's Leadership Book at gmail.com. And any time in my profession, in my academic studies, in my life, looking at politicians, anytime I saw good leadership that really inspired me, I'd send that email address a little email. Or if I saw ineffective leadership, I'd send that email address a little story about the ineffective leadership that I was observing. Or if I was just randomly going on a walk in the neighborhood and had some kind of revelation about leadership, some kind of random thought about leadership, I'd send an email. So I had this email address for years where I would just send emails. And then in 2022, I opened that email for the first time pretty much ever and read these stories that I've been collecting for 22 years about different leadership concepts. Sometimes I was referencing something I had read in a textbook. Sometimes I was referencing something I had, one of my supervisors. The best of them were ones that were a little of each, where I had read something about leadership kind of in my academic setting that I had also experienced or not experienced being led by others. And I would write these little reflections and send them to this email, and I collected them over 22 years, and now there's a book. So that's part of the mechanics. So real quick, and we're going to wrap up here, but if anybody has any questions, please put questions in the chat, because this was quite the adventure. The book is available. Actually, let me put, I think I can put this in the chat here. Bear with me 1 second. Y'all can tell me if this shows up. Hopefully this will show up in the chat. Oh, can't. Okay. So actually, I will. Here we go. I'm gonna have to turn this volume down. Bear with me 1 second, and I'm going to post in the chat a little bit of stuff. What I'm posting now is you can RSVP to the next week, April 10th. And let me tell you what I'm going to do April 10th. I'm going to talk about the history of leadership. So, y'all, once upon a time, there most developed countries with monarchies didn't have an idea of leadership because the king or the queen was the leader and you just accepted it. There was nobody was pondering what makes a leader or doesn't make a leader, right? And so I'm going to next week at 12 o'clock, same time on Thursday, 12 o'clock East Coast time. I'm going to delve into that. I'm going to talk about where did we come up with this concept. I'll tell a few funny stories along the way and a few interesting things to keep it from being boring. But you'll come away from that session with an understanding of why the heck do we have the word leadership? Where did it come from as a concept, right? Because we throw the word around and there's 100 definitions. But if you know where it came from, you can discern better what definition is best. I hope that makes sense. So that one's coming up next week. The week after that is five key mindsets. So the next chapter in my book is five key mindsets for leading with emotional intelligence. My book is broken into five mindsets and then seven skills. Mindsets and skills are different. Mindsets are belief patterns that you have, concepts that you have. And I've had five key mindsets that you need to cultivate first before you go about the business of building the skills. And so a lot of times, especially my corporate clients, they want to get straight into skill building. And I'm like, that I understand that. I understand that. But we need to get some mindsets first to make the skill building sticky, to make this to so that when we teach skill building, they have something to connect it to. And these five mindsets do that. So that's going to be on April 17th. And then on April 24th is cultural awareness in leadership. This is in the news. You hear things about AI, and you hear some people who think it's critical for all of our organizations. You hear some people who think it's scary or they have questions about it. And the reality is that all of our organizations are diverse. They are. So D, check. It's already here. Equity. Almost all of us believe that folks deserve fairness, and when folks aren't treated fairly, that we should sort of compensate for that. That we should make things different once we know somebody hasn't been treated fairly. That's equity and inclusion. The best leaders I know listen. They listen. As a matter of fact, the session after that, when I get to the skills, the number one skill of leading with emotional intelligence, the number one skill is listening. And listening, by definition, is inclusion. It is. And so, even though those words may sound scary in some circles, I'm just going to talk about them in their everyday application because they are real. Yeah. So these are some of the sessions coming up. I posted in the chat where you can RSVP to that. Also in the chat, you can get the book. I would encourage you to buy the book. You can buy it directly from my website. There's also a Kindle version, an e-reader version available on Amazon, and a paperback version on Amazon. I like it when people buy it from my website, though. Um, and then also follow us on LinkedIn. Follow Adaptive Challenge Consulting on LinkedIn. It's more than just me. I do have a team of awesome affiliates to join me with different clients as needed. This can take you. I also have a course, and the course used to be too expensive. I think it was originally $229, but now the course is down to $40, and I think it's like $39.99. I think it is. But the course, there's one chapter in the book, Leading with Emotional Intelligence, that gets into the Myers-Briggs. And I mentioned earlier that I'm a Myers-Briggs certified interpreter. And the Myers-Briggs, when we stop doing it wrong and when we start keeping it in its proper limited context, it's a powerful, powerful tool. Powerful tool. And so the online course is about how can you use the Myers-Briggs the right way to increase your emotional intelligence. It's really, really cool. It's a self-paced course. It's about 5 hours long that you can do at your own pace, but it delves more deeply into the psychology part of emotional intelligence, sort of the how of building your emotional intelligence. So if you're curious, I've got the book, the course is out there as well. And the course is something I'm very proud of, but it's pretty singularly focused on the psychology piece of it. Whereas leading with emotional intelligence, we're going to go through mindsets, we're going to go through cultural humility, we're going to go through the skills, we're going to go through assessing and measuring, just like you mentioned earlier. How do you measure the effectiveness of your leadership efforts? So we're going to go through all those over the next 6 sessions. So so thank you so much for joining me. Again, follow Adaptive Challenge Consulting on LinkedIn. If you haven't gotten your copy of the book yet, the link is right there. So get a copy of the book. I love it when people book. I'll sign a copy if you're interested. That's also if you're local to Central North Carolina, Greensboro in particular. I'm doing a live book event and signing, and I'm going to double check here. I think it's Thursday, April 17th. Let me just double check that. It is Thursday, April 17th at 6 p.m. Our good friends at Scuppernong Books in Greensboro on Elm Street, which is a great privately owned bookstore. As a matter of fact, I met the owner of the bookstore because he's a fellow band and drum and bugle corn nerd, and a great, great guy, great local business. Their coffee is fantastic, and I'm a live book event there. So if you're in the area, if you're in the Triad area, come on by. It's 6 o'clock that evening. I don't have to say East Coast time because if you're already here, you know what time we're in. But it's 6 o'clock that evening down at Stephanopoulos Books. And yeah, I'll sign books if folks are interested in that. I think I am going to do a small read from the book and a few little sections that I'm going to share, and it'll be a good time. For the community event. But thank you for joining me today. Again, next week I hope to see you here. Invite some friends along, and we have a great conversation again. Next week is about where did we even get the idea of leadership. So RSVP for that. Invite some friends, and I look forward to engaging you then. Otherwise, have an amazing, amazing Friday. Take care.